So this Valentinus is the most important early Christian of the early 2nd century who is later determined to be a quote-unquote Gnostic. That is a kind of Christian who bases their own system of salvation on knowledge. But we know that Hadrian was in Egypt in the late 120s. He actually established a new city in Egypt called Antinopolis. When his boyfriend accidentally drowned in the Nile, he was deified by Hadrian there. So we definitely know that Valentinus is very familiar with Hadrian and might have seen him passing by. This is the time when Christianity is being invented. This were hundreds of years before so-called orthodoxy. Valentinus knew Jewish traditions. It's just that he didn't identify them as the essence of Christianity, and he had no love or loyalty to the Jewish deity. And this is very, very important for Christians to know today, because the Christianity that they have is sort of a product of 4th century developments, which are 2 centuries after Valentinus himself. It's in some way appropriate, so close to Valentine's Day, but unfortunately, Valentinus has pretty much nothing to do with Valentine's Day, unfortunately. That is another dude named Valentinus. So this Valentinus is a really, really important character for early Christianity, and we covered Simon in a previous episode. So Simon is the most important Christian, later categorized as Gnostic. He's the most important Christian thinker in the 1st century who is later categorized as Gnostic. And arguably, Valentinus is the most important early Christian of the early 2nd century who is later determined to be a quote-unquote Gnostic. That is a kind of Christian who bases their own system of salvation on knowledge. And so knowledge is very, very important for this figure. Unfortunately, all that we have from this figure, and he wrote sermons, he wrote letters, he wrote biblical commentaries, it seems the vast majority of it has been destroyed. What we have are authentic fragments, and about 7 of these that everyone agrees come from Valentinus. So he is born about the year 100 near Alexandria, Egypt, and it's in Alexandria that he is educated. Now, there's lots of mysteries about how early Christianity started in Alexandria. Valentinus is a key figure in early Alexandrian Christianity, and it's a different Christianity that arises than in other areas. Interestingly, as a middle-aged person, he decides to travel to Rome. This is about 135, and he there makes such an impact that he is actually voted almost to the a leadership position in the Roman Church. Now, in the 140s, okay, there's no such thing as a pope yet, but he attained a very, very high rank in the Roman Church at that time. So Valentinus, during his own day, this is very important, that if you're thinking in terms of these categories of orthodoxy and heresy, that's really not the way to think about it at all at this point, because those terms haven't been invented, those concepts haven't been invented. So Valentinus in his day is never, as far as I'm concerned, seen as a heretic, and he would have been very, very surprised if anybody called him that. And indeed, I think he might have even been surprised if somebody called him a Gnostic, because that term also is not seemingly in common use at this period. What Valentinus does see, interestingly, is he claims to see this vision of the Logos, and Logos is this term that is usually translated word, but it could mean mind, it could mean intelligence, it could mean speech. He claims that he sees this vision of a baby, and what's interesting about this baby is this baby has the ability to speak and apparently has the ability to walk. And Valentinus is so struck by this that he asks the baby who he is? And the baby replies, I am the Logos. And
Wow.
from this baby, we hear what is called a tragic tale, and we don't know the substance of the tale. But this does indicate that Valentinus, in addition to being a really highly educated theologian, was a visionary as well. And as I mentioned, he's almost appointed leader of a dominant Roman church network. And the only reason why he fails to attain that position, we hear later on, is because the person he was running against was a confessor, that which means a person arrested for being a Christian and nearly killed. Valentinus didn't have that to his credit, but he was definitely a very, very important early church leader in both Alexandria and Rome. And that's what's so exciting, because this is a time where he is really, really valued. He, interestingly, has another claim to fame, and this is that he's the first known Christian to publish a psalm book of his own compositions. And we have one of these psalms, which I'll just translate and read for you here.
Oh, wow.
It's interesting. Valentinus wrote, everything by spirit I see suspended, everything by spirit I sense conveyed, flesh suspended from soul, soul hanging on air, air suspended from ether. From the depths are born fruits, from the womb is born a baby.
Wow.
Now, it's a very mysterious psalm, and obviously, if this really was put to music, I'm sure it sounded very beautiful in the
Mm.
original Greek. There's real speculation about actually whether some of these terms are symbolic. For instance, whether the baby is actually symbolic of the Logos that he saw in his vision. But
Yeah.
one thing that we can tell from this psalm, which is called Harvest, is that Valentinus didn't hate the world. I mean, when he looked at the world, he saw this golden chain of beauty, and the levels of reality connected to each other like a golden chain. So, unlike later false representations of so-called Gnostics, Valentinus is not anti-cosmic. He loves the world. He's part of the world, and as we see from his fragments, he believed the world was a representation of true reality above. And so he's not some kind of ascetic world hater. And this is really important to get across. But what did make Valentinus distinctive, as it did for Simon of Samaria, is that he immediately distinguished the Judean deity from the supreme good, who is his name for God. And Valentinus, like other Christians, obviously he believed in God, he believed in the oneness of God, and he thought that the Judean deity was some being who was far less than God. But interestingly, and this is in definite contrast to Marcion, whereas Marcion depicted, on the basis of the Hebrew Bible, the creator as evil, Valentinus didn't depict the Judean deity as evil at all, but as some sort of neutral being who was just, that is fair, and progressing on the path of knowledge. So he is, one might call him an angelic figure, but Valentinus never says that. Uh, but he is some kind of subordinate figure who is like most Christians, actually, on his way toward progressing in knowledge and perfection. And this is a very distinctive take on the Jewish deity. He's not the true God, but he's also not outright evil.
Wow.
Humans are created by angels. Now, this might sound a bit radical today, but this isn't radical at all if you read Genesis 1:26, where God is, or the Judean deity is saying, let's make a human being in our image. He's talking to the angels, and it was a very long Jewish tradition that humans are in fact created by angels, because God, or the good, the high God, The one isn't involved in the material creation. He's involved in creating the higher mind, or what Valentinus called a superior seed. And this superior seed was invested into the material Adam. And this is what allowed Adam both to stand up and to speak back to his angelic creators. And in fact, Valentinus tells the story where when the angels made Adam, Adam was just sitting there absolutely lifeless. But when the superior seed came into him, he stood up and started talking boldly. And the angels were so shocked by this that they didn't expect this. It's sort of like Frankenstein when Victor Frankenstein creates the monster and he actually wakes up. This was the reaction of the angels. They actually tried to destroy Adam. They were so afraid. That's how Valentinus tells us. And it seems to be an interpretation of this passage where the cherubim at the end of Genesis 3 threatens Adam with a flaming sword. But anyway, Adam, interestingly enough, is able to pass on this superior seed, not to everybody, but to only certain of his descendants. Now, this is a funny tradition, which I throw in here at the end. Valentinus doesn't say much about, or in the fragments that remain, we don't learn much about Jesus. Okay. But one thing, interestingly, that Valentinus does say about Jesus is that Jesus had such great self-control that whatever he ate was completely used up with him,
Wow.
and that since there was no corruption within him, he did not defecate. And so Jesus is the great exception to that children's book, Everybody Poops, because this is a clear sign that
Like
for
Kim Jong Il.
for him, Jesus is a real flesh and blood human being. And so don't let anyone convince you of that. Okay. He definitely has intestines for Valentinus. But what's interesting is Valentinus doesn't want corruption. Valentinus views digestion as a corruptive process. And so basically, Jesus, since he didn't have corruption inside of him, he didn't produce literal feces. And that's about the kindest way I can say it. Clearly, Valentinus, he's up to date on the recent theories of digestion. And yes, his theory is that Jesus only eats just as much as he needs to survive. So there's no extra energy that's needed. And so the rest of the stuff is just completely, it just disappears and is expended. That's his view. That's exactly right. But again, it's not that Jesus is some kind of ghost or spirit being. He is just a perfect human being who is, in a sense, perfecting the design of the human body. Because, I mean, let's face it, that it's like you could view it as a design flaw of the angels who created us, so that we are incredibly messy and disgusting creatures who, basically. We eat and then we get rid of it in an incredibly messy way. So that's not the case for Jesus. But I just throw that in here because it's a bit of it's also a bit of a humorous understanding.
It is pretty fun.
So interestingly, also for Valentinus was, as I said before, he's a very educated man. He's from Alexandria, and you've got that huge library of Alexandria. It's a well-known educational center, and so was Rome at the time. And Valentinus didn't, he obviously read books like Genesis, but he didn't really emphasize Jewish tradition. You could tell that he read a lot of philosophy, and particularly Neo-Pythagorean philosophy, but he believed, like some Christians today and some enlightened people, that the truth is not only out there, the truth is everywhere. And this is one of the things that he said. Many of those things written in publicly available books are found written in the Church of God. They hold in common expressions from the heart, a code written in the heart. And so this was a guy who definitely wasn't afraid of secular literature. He read everything from mythology to other different kinds of theology to philosophy. And he basically he didn't seem to have had a real sharp distinction between scriptural books, what we think of as the New Testament, which in his period was not invented.
Right.
And so he didn't seem to make a great distinction between scriptural books and other books, which he calls publicly available, which obviously could be anything really. And so this is a really an amazing way of viewing truth. Valentinus is so confident in he's a Christian, but he's so confident in his knowledge of the truth that he's not afraid to get it from everywhere. And that's definitely very different than conservative branches of Christianity today.